Good evening, and thanks for joining us. I'm Jan Kowalski, and I'm here on behalf of Green Slate I Incorporated. Green Slate is a non-for-profit entity, and they are committed to assisting ex-convicts. Their programs include reentry programs, feeding the families of Inglewood, and they also have a community service program through the Circuit Court of Cook County. And tonight we're talking about domestic violence, and tonight I also have a guest. My guest tonight is Professor Deborah Stark, and she's the director of the Domestic Violence Clinical Advocacy Program at the John Marshall Law School. Good evening.
Good evening.
Tonight we're going to be discussing the domestic violence in honor of it being Valentine's Day. And again, for the viewers, I'm Jan Kowalski. There we go, Kowalski. And some people have difficulty pronouncing my name, so I have this cute little panda bear. It's not a panda bear. Hold on. It's my little koala, and it's kind of hard to see him. He's a little small there. But my koala has his skis on, and that's just to help you remember my name. Some people might say that I'm a Kawasaki, but I'm not a Kawasaki. And to further help you with my name, sorry about that, I am 100% qualified. And again, I'm Jan Kowalski. And back to me. And I'm an attorney in private practice, and I primarily practice in civil litigation. And I just wanted to introduce my guest, Professor Stark. And Professor, perhaps you can tell the viewers a little bit about yourself.
So I am a professor at the John Marshall Law School and director of our domestic violence clinic. I've been teaching there since 1994. That dates me, and very excited that we have this clinic that's been around for a few short years, but we've done a lot of good work, and very excited to share with your viewers what we do and take questions.
And what does the domestic violence clinic do at the John Marshall Law School?
Well, I like to say that we operate like a mini law firm and a think tank. We operate like a mini law firm because people who experience domestic violence experience a wide array of abuse that therefore implicates a large number of laws that they need to navigate through to become safe and whole again. So we operate like a mini law firm in that we offer legal services to survivors of domestic violence on virtually every legal issue they need to go through to become financially independent, which is part of being safe and whole again. And there's 8 practice areas that we cover that I can share with you.
Certainly. Why don't you tell our viewers a little bit about the domestic violence clinical advocacy program that the John Marshall Law School has, Professor?
Right. So the way we work, we have students who train in the program on domestic violence. They're supervised by adjunct faculty, attorneys who are experts in these 8 practice areas. And we take cases through referrals from DV service organizations who first provide risk assessment and safety planning, other services to our clients. And then we try to employ what I like to call holistic, comprehensive, compassionate, and supportive legal assistance. And as I mentioned, there's 8 areas. It kind of takes me a while to go through all 8 areas. So stop me in the middle if you have questions as I go through. But I thought it might help your listeners to know because, frankly, there are so many laws in Illinois that exist that are there to protect survivors of domestic violence, and people are not aware of these laws. And so I consider this a great opportunity when we're describing what our clinic does to kind of describe the areas of law that people can get help with. So the first one that most people think about and are already aware of is orders of protection, to stay away, stop the abuse. But the array of remedies under the Illinois Domestic Violence Act for somebody seeking a stay away remedy are far more comprehensive, and part of what we do as a clinic is go through with the client all of their needs and see to what extent can their needs be met through an order of protection. So that's the first area of law. The next one that most people think about is if they're married and they want to separate from an abusive partner, going through a divorce and all the related issues. If they're not married and they have children in common, there's parentage issues relating to what used to be called child custody, which is now referred to as parenting time and parenting responsibilities. And that's a big focus for us because children are very much harmed just from exposure to domestic violence, even if they're not the direct target of it. So we're very aware of that, and we work with domestic violence survivors seeking divorce, child support, what used to be called custody, marital distribution of assets and debt, sometimes spousal support. So financial justice is really a critical part to being safe. We try to focus on safety, both the immediate term and long term, and the protection of children and our clients in that context. So that's the second area.
Oh, wait, before you go on, Professor,
Sure,
I was wondering,
sure.
are there any programs out there that are directed to children who have unfortunately witnessed abuse in their households?
Yes, absolutely. In fact, our conference last year was all about therapeutic programs for children who've been exposed to domestic violence. So there are a lot of domestic violence service organizations. One that comes to mind is Between Friends, who work with us. They're one of our DV service organization referring agencies, and they were a part of that program. But there's many other DV service organizations that work with parents, work with children, and building that relationship between the protective parent and the children who are exposed to the domestic violence. People also sometimes ask, what about the person who has been abusive, who's been battering? What exists for them? And there's something in Illinois called partner abuse intervention programs, and we seek that when we're getting an order of protection often, or even in the divorce or parentage case, because if the former spouse has a child in common with our client, there's going to be continuing contact between them. And it's really important to work with somebody who batters. Oftentimes, there's an attitudinal basis to it. Maybe they grew up and saw that in their household and otherwise. And so partner abuse intervention programs are really helpful, both to the person who's being abused, that it should stop, and even for the person who has offended in the past. And it helps them establish a better relationship with their children. So divorce and parentage is a big area for us. Financial remedies is another big area, and there are several forms. So a lot of our clients are experiencing identity theft and have other debts that they have to struggle with, and so we help them.
Wait, Professor, is that part of the abuse, the fact that someone can abuse the other spouse financially? Is that part of the abuse?
That's a huge part. That's a huge part of it. So there's different reasons why somebody might not be the ideal Valentine's Day partner to somebody else. And sometimes it's not what we might call domestic violence. It could potentially actually be an anger management issue or related to substance abuse, but all too often when there's been battering and other forms of abuse, the goal is to coercively control their partner. And when that happens, it's really important to realize that, and it leads to, as I was indicating a little bit earlier, wide forms of abuse, isolating them from friends and from family, causing them to lose their jobs, causing homelessness, because maybe they're living somewhere and they're afraid to terminate their lease early and run away because they're afraid of the impact on credit, let's say, yet there's an Illinois law that allows you to terminate the lease early under certain conditions, and that's one of the practice areas that we cover. So yes, financial abuse is a huge part of the different pattern of power and control. And I didn't realize you had this nifty over here area where I could have put some diagrams. There's anybody listening to this can just Google the words power and control wheel. And you'll see, most people, if you're not trained on domestic violence and you haven't experienced it before, you don't realize that it's not about hitting necessarily. These other forms of abuse are sometimes worse, and there are many forms.
Professor, let me jump in here. I was just wondering, the other forms of abuse, it's not just physical violence. For instance, isn't harassment another form of domestic abuse?
Yeah, so and that phrase is a very technical one. You might call it emotional abuse, but the phrase harassment comes right out of our Illinois Domestic Violence Act. It's one of the forms for getting an order of protection. Unlike most states really, for their order protection laws, they focus on physical abuse and what might be a crime, like literally punching somebody or something to that effect. Whereas our Domestic Violence Act protects people from harassment. Harassment is defined as conduct that is calculated to cause emotional distress to somebody else, in fact, causes that emotional distress to somebody else, and a reasonable person under the circumstances would have felt that. And that's actionable, meaning you can get an order of protection if somebody is engaging in that type of behavior. So yes, demeaning somebody to the point that they start to not feel good about themselves, start to question themselves. There's a reason for this kind of abuse, and the reason tends to be to make the person dependent upon the other person and not able to seek help and not able to get themselves out of the bad relationship.
Well, Professor, let me ask you, is it harassment if you take away your significant other's cell phone, for instance, or you check their cell phone? Mm-hmm. Would that be a form of abuse? And again, let me just pause here. We're here on KNTV, Channel 19 and 21, and I'm speaking tonight with Professor Stark, who's the Clinical Director of the Domestic Violence Clinical Advocacy Program at the John Marshall Law School. This is a live call-in program, and please feel free to call in with your questions at the number displayed on your screen, and we're discussing domestic violence. And Professor, back to you.
Yeah, no, that's an excellent question, and kind of like the kind of question we discuss in our class. Here's the thing. In isolation, if that was the only thing that ever happened, was that one time somebody took away somebody's cell phone or was checking the cell phone, if that was it over years, I doubt you'd get an order of protection for that. But that's not how things happen. Typically, that's part of a pattern with many other things.
Suppose my husband throws something at me, and he threw it at me in Christmas. Does it have to be any time nearby?
So that's an excellent question, too, because I've written law review articles on this. A lot of the judges, if you're looking for what's called an ex parte, quote, emergency order of protection, some judges do kind of look at the timing, and they say, how is there an emergency if the last time something physical happened was 3 weeks ago or 6 months ago? Maybe, it's not a problem anymore, because they presume that it's maybe an anger management issue and it's all settled down. But if what's really going on is a desire to control somebody else, taking the phone away, destroying the phone, doing something that happened a few days ago, a few weeks ago, is still very important to realize that there tends to be a cycle of violence. Sometimes somebody does something and then they apologize, they say it's not going to happen again, and you go through a whole cycle where eventually you're on eggshells with the other person. It's just a matter of time till it happens again. And if courts don't see the looming danger and just focus on when did the last act of abuse occur, and if it was more than a week ago, they don't see the emergency, that's a real problem. So I've certainly written on this topic, and I think some judges who are trained on domestic violence are very aware of that and would take it seriously.
Well, Professor, you indicated that there was essentially a cycle of domestic abuse. Is there a honeymoon period followed by a low period in this kind of cycle of abuse?
Sometimes yes, sometimes no. We've worked with many DV survivors, and it just depends. Sometimes early in the relationship, it goes through this typical cycle, but after you've cycled through several times over and over, eventually, instead of saying, I'm so sorry, I won't do it again, it converts to, it's your fault this is happening. I'm not doing anything wrong, it's all your fault. So yes, it's pretty typical for there to initially be the recriminations, and I'm very sorry, and it won't happen again, but then it does over and over again.
How does a healthy relationship differentiate between an unhealthy relationship? In other words, how do you know whether it's just a normal fight in your relationship versus you're a victim of domestic abuse? How can you tell the difference, Professor?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, too. We just covered this in class. And it's a hard question. There's what's called common couple conflicts. So, what are we doing tonight for Valentine's Day? Are we going to this restaurant? Are we going, to a different restaurant? Having a disagreement about that, or who's going to do the dishes, who's going to take care of the kids, little things like that, where each party is able to say what they're thinking and each is listening to the other. They may disagree, but in the end, they know that that they are respectful of each other. Where it's a real problem is when one person, a couple things, when one person is afraid of the other person. Now this is a really serious problem. Two, when the rule-making and decision-making don't make sense. When there's all kinds of special rules and it only applies to one person and there's severe consequences to the other person, that's a real signal that something's wrong. And I liked your other examples, too, about jealousy and checking the phone. Jealousy is a big signifier of a risk that there's domestic violence going on. Before the violence has started, it's something to watch out for. It's not true that just because somebody is jealous that that's a sign of true love. It's not. It's a sign of not trusting somebody.
Professor, perhaps you can tell me more about the John Marshall Law School, the Clinical Advocacy Program for Domestic Violence. What services do you offer for potential clients?
Right, so I was kind of going through earlier, there were 8 practice areas, so orders of protection, divorce and parentage cases, I think I mentioned debt relief and credit repair. Related to that is tax liability relief. Most people would never think, wow, what does domestic violence have to do with federal income taxes? Maybe we should have another class on tax day to discuss that further.
It's a great idea, Professor. You are welcome to come back and join us again.
But in fact, it's not unusual if you are in an abusive relationship, you're married to the abuser, they may say to you, sign this, and they don't let you look at it, review it, the tax return I'm referring to now. And you fear retaliation if you seek to read it, and yet in it are inaccuracies. So you've co-signed on a tax return that has, underreporting of income or over-reporting of deductions. Normally, if it's a joint return, there's joint and several liability. They're both responsible. But fortunately, the federal tax laws include something called innocent spouse relief. Yeah, very good, you know it. So that's something we cover, and in fact, it's kind of one of the things I'm really proud of because we've actually created interactive forms. Our students worked on this with a supervising attorney. Interactive forms where a user can go onto our webpage, answer a series of questions, yes or no, and based on their answers, they'll be told at the end, yes, it appears you qualify for innocent spouse relief. Here's the form you need. And if they do, we actually annotated the form with pop-up bubbles with information on how to do that. We're also going to try to do kind of like a, I forget the name of that group, where it spits out the form, TurboTax kind of thing, where you fill in certain information, the form spits out. So we haven't created that yet, but we're working on that.
Professor, where can our viewers get a hold of that website?
Well, so I'm going to give information about our webpage. The resources on it right now, there's some, but there are so many more we're in the process of doing. So keep checking it every few weeks. There's going to be more and more. The best way to do it instead of a long www type thing, and I didn't put anything on here. So the best way to do it would be literally just Google the John Marshall Law School Domestic Violence Clinic. And then you'll get what you need.
And Professor, if someone was interested in contacting the Domestic Violence Clinical Program at the John Marshall Law School, how would they get a hold of you?
Well, so again, I would go on the web page that we have, and then it gives my email address and phone number on it. But I do want to emphasize that the way we take on new cases is through the person who's seeking the representation first contacting a domestic violence service organization to receive risk assessment and safety planning. It's really important, and other resources. They then will send the referral to us with a referral form and an intake form, and then we take it from there.
I think we've got a caller, Professor. Caller, do you have a question or comment about our topic, domestic violence?
Yes, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Hello, Jan, and hello, Professor. How are you?
Hi.
Good evening.
Thank you.
Let me ask you, when you talk about domestic violence, how do holidays come to play, like Christmas and Valentine's, where people feel as though if you don't have a gift, you don't really care about them? How destructive is that thought pattern when it comes to relationships and domestic violence?
So,
How does that play?
yeah, so I heard two things. One was the timing of the domestic violence to holidays, and how does lack of giving a present affect things. So in terms of timing, I have heard that there's more domestic violence reported after a Super Bowl, at least in the past, than on a normal Monday morning, right? So that's an interesting thing. There is an element, at least with sports events and violence, although I know there's efforts now to put out PSAs. In terms of the holidays like Christmas, I don't know the statistics on that. And as for not giving a present, that seems to, if that's all that's going on, that strikes me as more a common conflict kind of thing. I'm disappointed. Why didn't you get me a present? But again, you have to look at everything, not just one isolated factor. I hope that answered your question.
I think we've lost our caller. Again, this is a live call-in program from CAN TV, and we're live on channels 19 and 21 and cantv.org. And tonight we're joined by Professor Stark from the John Marshall Law School. She's the director of the Clinical Domestic Violence Advocacy Program. Oh, and we're here live on CAN-TV, and you can call the number on the screen. We only have a couple more minutes, so get your calls in while you can. Professor, can you tell me a little bit more about the domestic violence program?
Yeah, I would love to. So I think I've covered, orders of protection, divorce and parentage cases, debt relief, tax liability relief. Other relief that we can help clients with include employment. So if you have a job and you need to take time away from work to appear in court, there's something called the Victim Economic Security and Safety Act that gives you a process to do that and not be penalized for it. If you need reasonable accommodations, let's say a former abusive partner knows that you work the night shift and now you want to work the day shift so that you're not as exposed, that's something that applies under that statute as well. So there's employment protections, there's housing protections. If you're worried about where you live, you want to terminate the lease early without having liability to a landlord, there's a process for that under the Safe Homes Act. If you want to change your locks, that's another form of relief we can
Professor,
offer.
is there also some assistance for immigration under the domestic
Yes,
violence?
thank you. So if you're undocumented, there's the ability to seek VAWA petition if you're married to a person who's a lawful permanent resident or a U.S. citizen, even if they're not cooperating anymore. There's U visas if you're a victim of certain crimes that can give you a path towards being here legally and working legally. There's T visas if the person's been trafficked. And we help with all of those things too.
And viewers, thank you for watching and participating in today's show. And again, I'm Jan Kowalski with Green Slate I. And my guest tonight has been Professor Stark from the John Marshall Law School, the Domestic Violence Clinical Advocacy Program. And Professor, is it possible for you to come back to talk to my viewers a little bit more?
I would love to. And in my final words, a happy Valentine's Day to everyone. Wishing all of you a safe and healthy relationship.
And good night.